My name is Dr. Thomas Webb, and I'm a doctor working across longevity, space, sports medicine, and human performance. And over the last several months, I've worked closely with high-performing entrepreneurs, millionaire founders, and executives and CEOs, helping them improve their energy, recovery, focus, stress resilience, and long-term performance. A large part of my work has involved understanding what actually happens to people operating under extreme cognitive demand, a lot of responsibility for long periods of time, especially when they continue performing externally, while internally their nervous system health and mental clarity start to gradually deteriorate over time. So what surprised me early on was that many of these people who looked the most successful externally were often struggling the most privately. These were people running large companies, leading teams, making high stakes decisions daily, and functioning at a very high level, basically a level most people would consider extremely impressive. But behind the scenes, a lot of them felt mentally exhausted, emotionally flat, unable to switch off properly. And honestly, we were able to review their biomarkers, their blood results, and you can see signs their health was starting to crack. These guys were feeling increasingly disconnected from themselves outside of work. Their identity was fully wrapped up in their performance, in their job, in their company, in their business. And honestly, I understood that state personally myself a few years ago, despite understanding the theory about health and performance professionally. As a doctor, my own nervous system became completely dysregulated. My dopamine system was overstimulated. My routines kept collapsing. I was in quite a chaotic state of mind. And eventually I ended up living in a van thinking I needed some big massive change, big massive reset to reset everything. But what this experience actually taught me, both personally and since then through working with high performing CEOs afterwards, is that burnout is not simply about working too much. In many cases, these people genuinely loved what they were building. And I even back then loved being a doctor to a degree. So that wasn't the issue. The issue here was the biology, the underlying biology, nervous system, recovery systems that were no longer capable of supporting this level of stress, stimulation, and cognitive demand that these lifestyles require. And this is where burnout becomes extremely misunderstood by a lot of people. Most people imagine burnout as some dramatic collapse where you suddenly cannot function anymore. But that is usually the final stage, not the beginning, not the start of the process. What actually happens first is a gradual, insidious shift in baseline over time. Energy tends to become less stable, sleep quality declines, focus becomes harder, noisier, recovery becomes incomplete, and eventually even highly driven people start noticing that they're operating increasingly through pressure and stimulation rather than clarity and genuine energy. They constantly feel like they're being pulled in different directions, they're being reactive, and they're not able to get into that proactive, creative, deep state. So one thing I noticed repeatedly while working with these founders, CEOs in this longevity company is that many of them had essentially trained their nervous system to exist in a constant state of activation. They were constantly in fight or flight mode. Their brain was continuously switching between decisions, meetings, emails, responsibilities, problems, notifications, and high stakes thinking with very little genuine recovery in their day. So over time, their body adapted around this environment. And this is important neurologically because the nervous system is highly adaptive. When your brain repeatedly experiences urgency and stress, without enough downregulation afterwards, your sympathetic nervous system gradually becomes chronically elevated. You're never able to fully switch off. You're never able to recover. And that state is, of course, very useful, very effective in the short term, in short-term bursts, because it improves alertness and performance under these high stakes, under the pressure. Even in doctors, in my own life, this state is extremely important. In emergency situations, you want to be in this state. But the problem is not during these times, it's when you're switching off, when you're trying to recover. You can't stay in this state all the time, or that's going to lead to burnout. So this is the problem. When it becomes chronic, it starts creating problems everywhere else in your life. Sleep becomes lighter, less restorative, attention becomes fragmented, and mood becomes less stable. Recovery weakens, and eventually the brain starts struggling to properly switch out of this performance mode. This is why, in my experience, so many high performers describe this feeling of being exhausted while simultaneously being unable to fully relax. Now, obviously, this is something I go much deeper into if you work with me one-on-one, and we can create a personalized plan where I break down how this chronic stress, overstimulation, dopamine dysregulation, and nervous system overload interact physiologically. And more importantly, how to actually rebuild these systems properly so people stop cycling between this temporary motivation and long-term exhaustion. But what played a large part in all this is one thing I noticed repeatedly among highly successful CEOs. And that's that most of them weren't even actually facing a productivity problem. The thing that was actually holding them back was regulating their work, regulating their output, their energy. From the outside, they looked disciplined, but internally, many of them were relying almost exclusively on pressure, urgency, caffeine, stimulation, and stress. All of these outputs to keep them in this high flight mode, this high activation mode. And again, as that can be very effective temporarily, it becomes increasingly unsustainable over time. And as I saw with blood results, with their biomarkers, this really did show in their health after a while. So eventually the nervous system starts pushing back against this constant activation. Your body starts breaking down, and you start to really feel that in your own health and your own energy levels. This is where people begin experiencing brain fog, emotional flatness, anxiety, inconsistent motivation, poor sleep, and loss of focus, and a growing inability to recover properly between these periods of high functioning work. And because many high performers tie their identity so closely to achievement, to output, to their productivity, they often respond to this by trying to push even harder, more optimization, more productivity systems, more discipline. But if the underlying nervous system is dysregulated, intensity alone eventually stops working, because you cannot sustainably override biology forever. This is also why I think modern burnout is heavily connected to overstimulation. Most people, especially entrepreneurs, high performers, even in my case and my colleagues' case, high performing doctors, they rarely experience true mental stillness anymore. Even their recovery is filled with stimulation through phones, content, emails, notifications, or passive consumption. So physiologically, their brain never fully settles. And over time, that constant input creates a feeling that many people struggle to articulate properly. Life starts feeling mentally noisy all the time. You can technically have time off while still feeling internally on, because the nervous system no longer remembers what genuine recovery, stillness, calmness feels like. One of the biggest shifts I made personally, and one of the biggest shifts I now guide clients through, is learning how to rebuild regulation before trying to maximize performance again. High performance should be a byproduct of your ability to manage your own health and systems, not the other way around. So this means improving sleep quality, circadian rhythm, reducing unnecessary stimulation, creating periods of low input recovery, and training consistently again, spending more time outdoors, rebuilding routines gradually instead of relying on motivation spikes. And perhaps most importantly, rebuilding an identity outside constant productivity and work. Because one thing I've seen repeatedly among these millionaire founders, CEOs, is that many of them eventually lose the ability to separate themselves from performance. Their structure comes entirely from their work, their stimulation comes from achievement, and their nervous system truly exists in high alert mode. And this is probably why their hobbies, movement, relationships even, recovery and calmness matter so much psychologically and physiologically. Without these things, people eventually lose contact with themselves outside of achievement. Now, obviously, this entire process is significantly deeper than I can fully explain in one video, and honestly, it's very much personalized to the person. So if you do want this personalized plan, you're a high performer, and actually, very importantly, if you're a doctor, because I'm only working with people like me, if I've been through it myself, it needs to be something I can say I've been through, and I'm a doctor, so I help high performing doctors with this. These systems that I built made me stop trying to force productivity through stress and started rebuilding stability instead. Over time, my thinking became significantly clearer. My energy stopped fluctuating so dramatically. I regained a level of calmness, focus, and consistency that I generally thought I had lost permanently. That is ultimately what I want people to understand about burnout. It is rarely a sign that you're weak, incapable, or not driven enough. Most of the time, it is simply the predictable result of operating under chronic stress and stimulation without systems strong enough to support recovery, regulation, and long-term performance. And once you understand that, the solution becomes much clearer. So, if you want help implementing this properly and you're a doctor, then you can click on the link in the description and I will see you there. Otherwise, I will see you on the next video.